In just a few short hours, you can see that those that you love the most and that you've given your best to are about to enter a crisis that's going to destroy everything. Nothing will be the same after 5 or 6 hours go by. The foundation you've laid, everything you've told them, will all be gone. What do you say? What do you do? That's really actually where we find ourselves in John 13. If you've got your Bibles, I'd love for you to get them out. We're entering what most scholars call the farewell discourse. And what the farewell discourse is, it's the last words that Jesus has before he goes to the cross. Hours away, Jesus knows what's happening, and his disciples are completely unaware. They're blind. But Jesus knows. He's prepared this meal ahead of time. He's arranged where it's going to be. He's even told his disciples, go into the place where I've arranged, because they've asked, where should we have this meal? Where should we set up the table for this Passover feast? And he says, oh, I've already arranged. Go talk to that guy, and he'll say, I've got the room ready. Jesus has everything set up for this final meal. And he knows it's just that. It's the final meal. What we're going to be doing for the next several weeks is looking at this incredibly beautiful, painful, glorious couple of chapters that really bookend the ministry of Christ. They're the last words. Imagine if you just knew what was coming. You could see what was coming, and your friends and family couldn't, but you could. What would you say? What would you do? What we're going to look at is what Jesus says and what he does at the table. And Danny's already alluded to the fact that we take communion, and we take communion every week. And for the next several months, we're going to be taking communion at the table together in the midst of the message, somewhere at the beginning, maybe the middle, and like today, at the end. So don't hesitate to get it if there's some in the foyer or in the back, if you haven't already got it, because that's where we're going to be going, is to the table together here shortly. John 13, really there isn't a whole lot of teaching. John 13 is the beginning of this farewell discourse, and what I find fascinating about this 3-chapter chunk, you've got 14, 15, and 16, is really where the red ink flows, right, if you have a red letter Bible. What I find amazing about those 3 chapters, though, is that they're bookended by Jesus washing his disciples' feet, and then they end with him saying a prayer. So on either side of his teaching, there is sacrificial service and rich, just theologically rich, personal prayer. I want us to keep that perspective in mind as we drill down in to know what it's framed in by on either side. So what we're going to do is look at this opening scene at the table, and we're going to read the first 17 verses to just lay the groundwork. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin. John writes, it was just before the Passover feast, and Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. And Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, that he'd come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer garment or his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. And after that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, you're going to wash my feet? And Jesus replied, you don't realize now what I'm doing, but later you'll understand. No, said Peter, you'll never wash my feet. Jesus answered, but unless I wash you, you have no part with me. And then Lord, he says, Lord, Simon Peter replied, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. And Jesus answered, a person who's had a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body's clean. And you're clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him. And that's why he said, not everyone is clean. When he finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. And he asked, "Do you understand what I've done for you?" He asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that's what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I've set for you an example so that you should do as I've done for you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you'll be blessed if you do them." Not all of our translations muddle this up, but there's a word that John very intentionally uses throughout these 17 verses that I think John really wanted to jump off the page, and maybe you heard the repetition. The NIV translates it a couple different ways, but did you hear the word Jesus knew? He knew where he was. He knew who he was. He knew where he was going. Did you hear him say, the disciples, he said, "Do you understand what I've done for you?" The word that John uses, that he puts in that he has Jesus saying there, is really the word for to understand or to know. Some translations just translate it know. Do you know? Do you know? Do you know what I've done for you? And really the word actually means to see. The derivative is to see. And John's really into this word. In fact, he uses this word more than 3 times, the other gospel writers. This word to see, to understand something, is really when you see it. You really grasp it. You see what's going on. And John wants us to see a lot of things. I just want to key in on 3. Okay? John wants us to see 3 things. Those 3 things are Jesus, right, sees who he is. He wants us to see who's at this table. That's what John wants us to see. He wants us to see who's at this table. He wants us to see who this table's reserved for, and he wants us to see what's on the menu, okay? That's what he wants us to see. John, in fact, uses this word 85 times in his gospel, and by comparison, the other gospel authors use it 20. So he really wants us to see something about Jesus, and he has a little cluster of this word to see. He wants us to see who's at the table. Now notice, he uses that word in the first part. It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew, you can just put, he can see. He sees that the time has come. He sees that the storm has been building and it's finally going to hit the shore. He knew, he could see, the time had come for him to leave this world and to go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed the full extent of his love. If you jump to verse 3, it says, Jesus knew. Again, that's he could see. He could see that the Father had put all things under his power and that he'd come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal and he washed his disciples' feet. John wants us to see who is getting up from the meal and washing his disciples' feet. This is not an ordinary first century Israelite man, though he was certainly all of those things. He was all of those things, and yet John says, as a one who's peeking in like a fly on the wall, we're given a perspective the disciples don't have. What authors a lot of times call this is a fully omniscient perspective, meaning we're looking in on something and we see things that the disciples don't see. We're able to see who this person is. And John wants us to see that. He wants us to see that Jesus is God's Son. That he's not just a first century Israelite. He came from God eternal, from eternity past, and he's come to accomplish salvation in the present, and he's getting ready to exit and return to. That's who he wants us to see. This is no ordinary man washing the disciples' feet. And one of the things that's fascinating about that is that, in the ancient world and today, Jesus is not the only person to say, "I'm God." Right? That was a very unique claim to make, but he's not the only one to make it. Down through the years, and actually in the fairly recent past, there's been a lot of people, even in our culture, who've said, I am God. I'm the new manifestation of God's presence. I'm God's Son, or God is with me in a unique way. And what we need to do if somebody makes that strong of a claim is we need to evaluate, are they crazy? Are they telling the truth? Are they deluded? We need to examine their life. We need to examine, Are they going off into the woods and setting up a commune? What about their life that we could look at and validate? Does their character line up? Is what they say in public line up with what they say in private? We need to evaluate them. In fact, C.S. Lewis, very famous author, says, when Jesus says that I am God or I'm the Son of God, he sets us up with a dilemma. Either he's crazy or he's lying. And then he actually takes it a step further. He actually calls it a trilemma. He's either a liar or he's a lunatic or he's the Lord. Those really are your only three options. The fourth option, which we tend to like so much, is he's a nice, good teacher, is not an option. Jesus never said that that was all he was. That was a part of what he was. But he's either a liar, he's a lunatic, or he's the Lord. One he's become very famous, Lee Strobel, investigative journalist. I'm sure many of you have read The Case for Christ. And he actually sets out on a journey because his wife's become a Christian and he's afraid he's going to spend the rest of his life in a soup kitchen because his wife's now a Christian. And he seeks to basically prove that Jesus is not God. He says, this is a hoax. You've bought into a lie, honey. And so he takes a break from his professional career and he puts all his skills to work and he goes all around the country to interview some of the best scholars and thinkers throughout the country to basically ask them probing questions. One of the scholars he goes to interview, his name's Gary Collins. Gary Collins is a clinical psychologist, and the question he asks of Gary is Jesus deluded? By what we can see in the gospel accounts, is he lying? Is he crazy? Or should we take his claim seriously? And while he's interviewing Gary Collins, it says, he's talking about this dilemma or trilemma. And this is what Collins says as he gazes out the window at the beautiful, peaceful, snow-blanketed landscape. Jesus was loving, but he didn't let compassion immobilize him. He didn't have a bloated ego, even though he was surrounded by adoring crowds. He maintained balance despite having an incredibly demanding lifestyle. He always knew what he was doing and where he was going. He cared deeply about people, including women and children who weren't seen as being important back then. He was able to accept people while not merely winking at their sin. He responded to individuals based on who they were and what they uniquely needed. And then he concludes, so doctor, your diagnosis, I asked? All in all, I don't see any signs Jesus was suffering from any mental illnesses, he concluded, adding with a smile, he was much healthier than anyone else I know, including me. John wants us to see the one washing the feet of these disciples. That he is a man, he is a first century Israelite man, but he's much more than that. But he also wants us to see that Jesus sees who he is. Jesus knows who he is. And rather than being weird and off his rocker and displaying characteristics in private that aren't on display in public, what Collins will say later in the chapter is he's a fully integrated person based on everything we can see and then all the testimony reverberating on through church history. We have every right to think that what's given to us in this account is true. But he also wants to see who else is at the table, doesn't he? Because it's not just this incredible God-man that's at the table. Who else is at the table? He wants us to look at the people like Peter, who refused Jesus' servitude. He wants us to see people like Judas, who in a very short while is going to go out and hand him over for 30 pieces of silver. People like you and me are at this table. This table is reserved, actually, for a very small elite group. Did you know that? That this table that Jesus invites people to is both radically inclusive, it's open to everybody, and yet it's radically exclusive. There's only some people who can make it to this table, and do you know who those people are? This table, John wants us to see, is reserved for the people who will let Jesus serve them. Did you know that? Anybody can come to this table, and anybody can receive the emblems, and yet the The way to enter, the way to say, yeah, I've got a reservation at that table, is to say, I've got a reservation at this highly exclusive table because I'm willing to let Jesus be my servant. It's an incredibly humbling admission, isn't it? That's why Peter doesn't want Jesus to wash his feet. This isn't the first time Peter has struggled with Jesus being a servant. I mean, you know the rest of this. You know the backstory, don't you? When Jesus said, all who want to follow me must carry their cross. And Peter takes Jesus aside and says, no. And it says he rebukes Jesus, and then Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, right? Jesus is not the kind of king, warrior, Messiah that Peter wants. You're the one you're investing all your hopes in, the one you're investing all your dreams in, the one you left your family for, everything, is now going to go to a cross? He's going to dismantle the army, and he's going to go willingly into the jaws of death and say, my kingdom is above all kingdoms. And Peter says, no, that's not what my king does. That's not what my Messiah is not a suffering servant, and he's not my suffering servant. And Jesus says, if you don't let me serve you, you don't get to be a part of my kingdom. And we can read a lot into that, but what essentially that means is if you don't recognize that you need my service, that you need this foot washing, that you need this cross I'm going to die on, if you don't realize, if you don't let me serve you, you have no part of me. Friends, this is a highly exclusive table. And anybody's invited in one sense. Anybody can come. And yet, it's an incredibly exclusive table because only the people that come, they're not great, they're not powerful, they don't have a lot of money. They've said, I get to this table only because I recognize I need Jesus. So it's radically inclusive, and yet it's radically exclusive. And John wants us to see that. He wants us to see who's at this table. People like Jesus and people like us. But he also wants us to see what's on the menu. John doesn't go into all the details. The other three Gospels, they go into all the details where Jesus says, there's a new covenant that I'm cutting with you. There's a new agreement that I'm making with God before you, and all the details there. So John doesn't go into all of that, but he does give us the context. He says, just before the Passover feast, what's that? Well, the Passover feast is the great memorial celebration that all of God's people would come to Jerusalem, and they would enter into the festival of unleavened bread, and they would remember the Exodus. They would remember this grand climactic way in which God smashed Pharaoh, smashed Egypt, brought glorious signs and wonders, 10 plagues that basically brought the Pharaoh and all of Egypt to their knees, to where they finally said, we're tired of you building our kingdom, get out. Because the last plague was the worst of them all. The last plague was the death of the firstborn throughout all the land, except for God's people, because he'd warned them, I'm coming through camp and every firstborn is going to die unless you take the blood of a lamb and you put it above your doorpost. If I see that blood, I will pass over and you will be spared. And so they celebrate this incredibly momentous occasion where God smashed the rival kingdom and brought them out from underneath their power and their control. And so they're celebrating that with the lamb and the feast and the bread and the wine. And what John wants us to see is he's right there at the table. In the midst of the Passover feast, Jesus is the ultimate Passover lamb. He's leading a new exodus out from underneath, not just Egypt, that was bad enough, but he's leading us out from the slavery of sin and death itself, which Egypt was just a minor thing compared to that. This is sin and death that's been wrecking the entire world, and Jesus is leading a new exodus, a new people. There's a new creation, and it's taking place in the midst of the Passover festival. God's word is so rich. It's amazing how this is the only gospel where if you flip back several pages into the early part, John 6, 7, and 8, Jesus goes out into the wilderness and he feeds thousands of people with no more than just a little bit of bread and a few fish. And in the midst of that, he uses this incredible teaching moment to say, I don't know if you'll believe me or not, but that manna that came down in the wilderness, our ancestors, when they were brought out from Egypt, again, when they were brought out from underneath Pharaoh, that bread was me. And I don't know if you'll believe it or not, but that exodus that was done through Moses and all that was me doing that. And then he says, and if you can believe it or not, I am the bread of life. And then he even says, if you want to live, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood. And it was such a divisive statement because to a first century Israelite, that was like the height of, no, we don't do that. We don't even touch dead things, let alone eat dead people. The disciples even say afterward, they pull him aside and they say, loose paraphrase, Jesus, we've followed you and we do believe you're the Messiah, but this is a hard saying. Can you help us understand this? This is a hard saying. Because what Jesus was doing was he was sifting the crowd. He was wanting to see who really wants the true bread from heaven, who really wants the life that I've given them. I'm not actually going to ask you to eat my flesh and drink my blood, but I'm sifting those who really want to push in deeper and understand what's really happening, really understand what's on the menu if you want to live. And that's where we find ourselves this morning at the table. John has wanted us to see who's at this table. Jesus, God's one and only Son, who knew he was such. He wants us to see people like Peter and Judas and Marcus and Danny and Brian and Erica. He wants us to see who this table's reserved for. Only the people who will let Jesus serve them. And he wants us to see what's on the menu. Jesus himself. And so I'd ask you just to take a moment and let's together take the bread and the cup, and let's see all of those things as John has asked us to do.